I'm walking through the Reformation series that Desiring God put together to give you a fuller history of Christianity. Join me.
Picture this. It's Scotland in the 1540s. The whole country is a tinderbox of religious conflict. Old ways are clashing with radical new ideas, and the stakes are literally life and death. And right in the middle of all this chaos, we get the story of one ordinary woman who makes a final fatal stand for her faith.
We shall shortly meet in the kingdom of heaven. These are supposedly the last words a mother named Hellen Stirke spoke to her husband, just moments before they were both executed for heresy. It's a line that would light a fire, echoing through the centuries as a rallying cry for a new kind of faith.
The story itself is just wow. So Helen is in the middle of a difficult childbirth, and people are telling her, pray to the Virgin Mary, she'll help you. But Helen refuses. She says she'll only pray to God through Jesus Christ. And for that, just for that, she's sentenced to be drowned, leaving behind her husband and their newborn baby. Her story became this perfect symbol of pure, simple faith against a corrupt and powerful church.
It's an incredible story of courage, right? But here's the thing. How much of it is actually true? So now, we're going to peel back the layers of this powerful legend and see what history is really hiding underneath.
And that's the question we really need to dig into. Because, whenever a story feels this perfect, this clean, this perfectly aligned with a cause, well, that's when you have to start asking, where did this story actually come from?
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Everything we know about Hellen Stirke, her exact words, that dramatic scene in childbirth, all of it comes from one single source. Not two, not three, one. And that source is the History of the Reformation in Scotland, written by none other than John Knox. Now, Knox wasn't some neutral observer. He was the fiery, charismatic leader of that very same Reformation. He was a revolutionary with a mission.
So let's really break this down piece by piece. Was she executed in 1544? Yes, the records confirm that happened. That's a check. But her exact last words? Come on, those were almost certainly polished and simplified by Knox for maximum dramatic effect. Did she reject prayers to Mary? Okay, probably, so that's partially true. But the bigger idea behind the story, that Catholics worshipped Mary like a goddess, well, that's a classic piece of Protestant propaganda, and it's seriously misleading.
Right, that last point is actually the key to this whole thing. The story hinges on this idea of worshiping Mary. To really get why this is so complex, we've got to dive into the weeds of theology. What did people at the time actually believe about her?
Okay, stick with me here, because this might sound a little academic, but it's super important. For centuries, the church made a huge distinction between two concepts, veneration and latreia. Latreia is the absolute hands-down worship that is only for God. But veneration? That's about showing deep honor and respect to a saint, like Mary. For a medieval Catholic, asking Mary to pray for you wasn't worship. It was more like asking a deeply respected and holy family member to put in a good word for you with the person in charge.
And you can really see the two worlds collide right here. The Protestant framing that Knox was pushing basically says praying to Mary is just a superstitious backup plan. But from the medieval Catholic perspective, it was an act of humility. It was about trusting God so much that you'd ask his most faithful servant to join you in prayer. It was never about making Mary equal to Christ. The core belief was always that grace comes from Christ and Christ alone.
So, the story has Helen saying this, which, you got to admit, sounds pretty modern, right? We can just pray directly to God. Mary's no different than us. This idea became a central pillar of the Reformation, and it was a radical break from 1,000 years of Christian tradition.
But here's the kicker. That idea, as revolutionary as it was in the 16th century, was also a huge departure from what the earliest Christians believed. If you go back centuries before the Reformation, you see a very, very different picture of Mary.
Just listen to this, from way back in the 4th century. Saint Ephrem the Syrian saw Mary not as an obstacle to God, but as the very door of faith. In this ancient view, her saying yes to God was the cosmic event that slammed the door on paganism and opened the way for Christ to enter the world. So for him, Mary wasn't getting in the way. She was the one who opened the door in the first place.
So, if the history and the theology are way more complicated than the story lets on, then what is this story? Well, it's a masterpiece of propaganda, and it was built using a very specific, very effective blueprint. Let's take a look.
John Knox was a brilliant storyteller. He knew exactly what he was doing. First, you take an ordinary person, and every woman, like Helen, to make her cause feel like the cause of all common people. Then you use her story to attack a specific belief, in this case, devotion to Mary, and frame it as backward superstition. Third, you bring the conflict right into the home, turning everyday things like childbirth and marriage into theological battlegrounds. And finally, you use her tragic death to make it all seem true. Her suffering becomes the ultimate validation for the entire movement.
Okay, so you might be thinking, this is just some old story, why does it matter today? Well, it matters a lot, because understanding how this story was built shows us just how powerful these narratives are, and how they don't just describe the past, they actively shape the future.
In the end, Knox's story had two main goals. The first was theological, to paint the Catholic Church as an evil, oppressive empire. But the second goal was maybe even bigger. It was nationalistic. Stories of martyrs like Hellen Stirke became the founding myths for a brand new Protestant Scotland. Her personal tragedy was transformed into a building block for a new national identity.
And that's really what this all boils down to. Hellen Stirke was a real woman who died for what she believed, but her story became something else entirely. It became a tool, a weapon even, carefully designed to tear down one world and build another in its place.
Which leaves us with a question for right here, right now. We're all swimming in powerful stories, in our politics, our culture, everywhere. So it's worth asking yourself, what stories are shaping your world? And who exactly benefits from the way they're being told?